The year is 1944, World War II, and Japan's imperial forces are fighting desperately to hold their ground. An incredible journey through the mind of a man who remained loyal to his mission against all odds, unaware that the world had moved on without him. From his training in guerrilla warfare to the moment he finally laid down his rifle, this is the unbelievable, true story of the last soldier of World War II. As the Allied forces advanced, most of Japan's defenses in the Philippines began to crumble. Soldiers were killed, captured, or forced to flee. But Onoda and a small group of men retreated into the dense jungle, determined to continue the fight. For Onoda, the war was not a temporary duty, it was a way of life. He was willing to sacrifice everything for his country, for his emperor. And so, as the bombs fell and the fighting raged, he and his comrades faded into the shadows of Lubang's jungle, ready to carry out their mission for as long as it took. In the following months, Japan's defeat became inevitable. By the summer of 1945, the country had been brought to its knees by relentless Allied bombing campaigns. On August 15, 1945, Japan officially surrendered. Back in the jungles of Lubang, Onoda and his comrades had no idea that their country had surrendered. They remained in hiding, living off the land and launching occasional guerrilla raids on local villages. They avoided contact with outsiders, convinced that the enemy would try to trick them into surrendering. Leaflets were dropped from planes, announcing that the war had ended. But Onoda refused to believe them. He saw the leaflets as nothing more than enemy propaganda designed to lure him out of hiding. How could the mighty Japanese empire have fallen? It didn't make sense to him, and so he continued his mission. Years passed. Onoda and his men lived in isolation, surviving on whatever they could find: bananas, coconuts, and stolen rice from local villagers. Their numbers began to dwindle. By 1950, several of his comrades had either died or surrendered, but Onoda remained resolute. He was determined to carry out his orders no matter how long it took. Throughout the 1950s, attempts were made to contact Onoda. More leaflets were dropped, messages broadcasted over loudspeakers, and even letters from his own family were sent to the island. But Onoda dismissed all of them. By 1959, Onoda was the last remaining member of his unit. Alone in the jungle, he continued to sabotage local farmers, steal supplies, and avoid detection. Each passing year must have seemed like confirmation that the war was still ongoing, that Japan was fighting somewhere, and that victory would one day come. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi arrived in Lubang. Standing face to face with the man who had given him his orders nearly 30 years earlier, Onoda was finally told that Japan had surrendered in 1945. His mission, at long last, was over. At first, Onoda struggled to comprehend it. For nearly 30 years, he had lived as a soldier, convinced that he was still fighting for his country. His dedication had consumed his life, and now, in the blink of an eye, it was over. He was no longer a soldier. He was no longer at war. With tears in his eyes, Hiroo Onoda finally laid down his rifle, his sword, and his grenades. His rifle was still in working condition, and he had over 500 rounds of ammunition remaining. Onoda handed it all over, ending one of the longest military campaigns in history. Onoda's return to Japan was met with both celebration and controversy. To many, he was a hero, an emblem of loyalty and dedication to the nation. But to others, his story was a tragic example of the devastating effects of war and blind obedience to orders. The world Hiroo Onoda returned to was vastly different from the one he had left in 1944. Japan had become an economic powerhouse, and the scars of World War II were slowly healing. Onoda struggled to adjust to modern life. He had spent the prime of his life in a jungle. Eventually, Onoda found peace. He moved to Brazil, where he became a cattle rancher, and later he returned to Japan to open a survival training school for young people. Despite everything, Onoda held no bitterness toward the world he had missed out on. In interviews, he remained proud of his loyalty and his service. For nearly 30 years, he lived in isolation, driven by a sense of duty and honor that few could truly understand.